All right, well, let's start us off. You've got one top of the list here. The Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, was kind of on fire at AUSA, made some news. Start us off, Ben. What was something that Secretary Driscoll said that caught your attention?
Yeah, he gave a really interesting speech at AUSA, a keynote speech, talking about new technology, talking about how do we become more agile, how do we become more lethal, how do we get better. Touched on a lot of subjects, but I think one he spent some time on is, as I'm sure you're not surprised by, the broken acquisitions process, and specifically this idea of right to repair, which is, if I buy something from you, Noah, can I repair it, or do I need your permission to repair it, right? If I buy my Toyota, can I take it to any mechanic? Can I just fix it on my own if I know how to do it? Or do I have to go to the Toyota authorized mechanic? And this is a huge issue for these massive weapon systems because, or not massive weapon systems, but expensive pieces of gear, because if you can only go to one authorized dealer, guess who has pricing power? Not the American taxpayer, the OEM who makes the equipment.
Toyota Inc., baby, and they do. They freaking always want you to go back. In fact, I've seen right to board with a dog, Ben. Have you ever got a dog from a breeder? They make you bring the thing back to the breeder. It's crazy. Not so much with kennels. Adopt people. Adopt your dogs. Anyway, back at it.
Exactly, though. It is something that the Army doesn't, DoD writ large, doesn't have uniformly. It does exist on some things, and it's something that is, at least the Secretary has said, is something that he is going to make sure happens in all new contracts. So that is exciting if it occurs, and will be exciting to me as a taxpayer to save some dollars.
Let's break it down for folks a little bit. The right to repair, the ability to fix something yourself or to take it to whatever dealer or aftermarket supplier you may choose. Does the Army have that right today?
You know, it depends on each and every contract, right? What is written into the contract? So there is no answer to your question. It depends. I'd say read the contract.
Great. It's on a deal-by-deal or a contract-by-contract basis. And so what is the Secretary actually proposing? What is going to change as a result of this speech?
It seems like he is proposing, and has already been doing this before, so it's not just for the speech that he was announcing this, but that the right to repair is going to be built into every contract at non-negotiable. This is going to be how the Army writes contracts.
Got it. So this is now the default. Any punitive measures for those who do not comply? Are we seeing anything about what's the stick to? I'm not sure if there's a carrot. What's the enforcement mechanism for this policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that is the crux of it. Do we have, a lot of these great ideas? Do we have the ability in the DOW to actually execute and do it? And how do you execute it? You need a contracting officer who understands the idea of right to repair. I think we think of contracting officers as you must study and memorize the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Requirements, right?
Federal Acquisition Regulation.
It's this long, insane document that has tons and tons of clauses and sections that dictate how to write a contract. It is, of course, important, but you also need to have conceptual understandings outside of that document. I might need the right to repair. And the same thing exists in software, the right to your own data. What does that mean? And so I think this is great if true, but you need to empower contracting officers. By empowering them, I mean get contracting officers who are trained. If they've been studying the FAR their whole career, but not how right to repair works, not how to write to your own data works, not how software architecture works, we're not equipping them properly. And then we need to hold them accountable, right? Once we've trained them, we shouldn't hold them accountable until we give them the tools to do it, right? But hey, there needs to be a stick if you do not build the right contracts, right? There's like the don't get fired if you buy IBM. Well, also, you should get fired, or, not immediately, but we can figure out a fair and proper process. But there should be a punitive measure if you're not doing these things that at the secretary level they're demanding.
Yep.
And by the way, are good for the American taxpayer.
I think there is an interesting question here about the limits of this policy. So right to repair with hardware makes a ton of sense. Right to repair with software, you talked about the parallel to owning your data. Some people want to take it farther, though. Some people would like to, push back against the idea of commercially owned software. Say, great, you can have commercially owned software, but we as the government should retain the rights to modify commercially owned software. Where do you come down on that?
I mean, I'm sure he has some thoughts on that, not in this speech, but I think there has to be a way, of course, in an emergency situation that the government can do that. But I think the government is better as a system integrator, being the ultimate system integrator, a smart system integrator that takes together different software pieces. To be a good system integrator, you need to own the data that goes across those systems, and you need to instill, a systems architecture of the overall system that is one that allows the data to move freely. If you have data that moves freely and there is no vendor lock at the data level, then you can put out a new solicitation if a vendor isn't performing, and the market will work, and people will compete to go do that thing that a vendor that you don't like is doing. But if the data is locked in that vendor's system, then it doesn't matter. You can't actually have that competition. So you just need to enable competition, and then you don't need to worry about the things you're talking about, in my mind, that the government can get the outcome they want. To get that outcome, though, they need to have the safeguards in place to be able to move that data wherever it needs to go so they can seamlessly go to any vendor, right? You or I, when we're using Gmail for our email, I have zero worries that if Gmail starts sucking, that I could not export all my data from Gmail and move to Yahoo, right?
I have some concerns. I'm not sure I can take my iMessages off my iPhone and move them over to the new paper phone that I want, which looks like a Kindle. I'm excited about that, but I'm a little worried about my data from the iPhone, and I'm a little bit worried about the social cost of having my green bubbles pop up. Here's where I think we come down on this, or how I come down on this, is when you talk about the ability of the government to modify, Noah Corp or Ben Corp or Flip source code, that starts to get a little hairy, with one or two major exceptions. And that is when I've been on the other side of this, especially when the government's working with startups, there will be a clause occasionally inserted into a software contract, especially if it's a license or any kind of SaaS, that source code be put in escrow in the event that the company go out of business.
Sure.
Now, why does this make sense? If little company X, gets their SBIR, they overextend themselves trying to deliver, the government's invested in that code, right? As long as they get what they're paying for, all good. But if that company makes a decision to shut down and exit the business, the government shouldn't be shit out of luck. The government should still have access to the product that they have paid for. And so putting that source code in escrow, I think that makes perfect sense. The idea, hey, government's got to be able to code alongside you as you're developing a COTS product, that's less my speed. But I don't think that's what Driscoll's suggesting here. And I think we can go ahead and say, hey, for you at home, staying apprised of how this plays out through contracting officer guidance, this may be something you start to see more of where, hey, if you're selling a hardware product, you're going to be expected to make that product modifiable by other OEMs or by the government itself.
And guess what will happen, though, Noah? If you make that happen, if there is a right to repair, that will push the cost down. And you won't actually need to do the repair because the government will be able to just go buy that piece competitively.
Let's see. We shall see. All right. Let's stay. We'll close that tab, but we will stay with Secretary Driscoll here for a second.